Okay, so welcome back from your break, everyone. We're going to talk about this being of God, helping you guys to understand this, because you may be interested in having a relationship with this being, but based on things that you've been taught in the past, it might be hindering you from having a relationship with this being. In fact, this is why I typically will teach this topic after we've talked about fear, because oftentimes people are taught to fear this being God. And if you had fear of this being God, you wouldn't be able to have a healthy relationship with it. It's like if you had fear of your life partner and you feared them, you wouldn't have a very healthy life and a very healthy relationship, because every time they come home, you'd be afraid that they're there, right? So if you've been taught to fear God, I'm going to teach you how to, you don't need to fear God. So that perhaps if you'd like to have a relationship with God, there are certain things that you might have been taught that's hindering you from doing that, and perhaps the discussion that we're going to have will free you from being able to, or free you to have a relationship with God. But if you're not interested in having a relationship with God, I'm going to teach you how to do that too by the time we get to the end of our discussion, because it's not God who determines whether you get to enlightenment or not, and this is why you can either choose to have a relationship with God or not. Okay, so first, just to get us started on this topic, I'd like to share a definition about God. Now, you may or may not agree with my definition of God, and that's fine. You can have whatever definition of God that you like. But in terms of what I'm describing and what I'm talking about, if you understand my definition, then you'll at least understand what I'm talking about. And again, you can adopt whatever definition of God that you like. That's your choice. It's your practice. But at least when I say the word God, you'll know what I'm talking about. So here, what I'm describing when I'm using the word God is the creator of the universe and source of all moral authority, the supreme being. This being is often referred to as God. In Muslim teachings, the same exact being is referred to as Allah. It's just a different way of referring to this individual. During the lifetime of the Buddha, they referred to him as Great Brahma. They would refer to God in that way. So it's all just different words referring to the same being, this supreme being. And this being is all-knowing and all-powerful, or omniscient and omnipotent. These are words that are used to often refer to this being. This being knows all that there is to know about every last little thing about the world and the universe. It's a formless being, oftentimes associated with the heavenly realm. And I will tend to use the gender he when I refer to God, but some people don't think of it that way, and that's fine. Again, you can think of this being however you like. You can think of it as a he or a she or an it, or, no gender whatsoever. The Buddha himself does teach that God is of a male gender, and it's not possible for him to be of any other gender. Same thing with Mara, this being that is interested in causing calamity and things like this. So by the way, whoever asked me that question yesterday about gender in the various realms, the Buddha did teach different genders. In this being of Mara, this formless being associated with the hell realm, he says that this being is a male, and he also talks the same way about God as well as being a male. So whether you adopt that same thinking or not is up to you. It's not really that important. I think about God as a he, because whenever I've had interaction with this being, it's been very masculine, very strong. Not that a woman can't be strong, because I know plenty of strong women, but this being has a very masculine energy whenever I'm spending time with this being, or this being is interacting with me. So I will tend to refer to God as he. So if you hear that, you'll understand why. But of course, you can adopt whatever type of thinking that you like. So God is this creator of the universe, the source of all moral authority, the supreme being, all-knowing and all-powerful. This is also the way that the Buddha describes God too, that you can see in his teachings that he refers to God as the creator. He also refers to him as the all-knowing and all-powerful. And when I talk about this moral authority, this is when we talk about the natural laws of existence. Well, if God is the creator of the universe, these are the natural laws that God established in the world. And now we're learning these natural laws about the world that we live in. The moral authority here is what moral conduct is maintaining and acting upon high principles for proper conduct. And that's what we're learning as part of the moral conduct of the cause and effect of the natural law of karma. Well, oftentimes people are taught that God is controlling people, or God has a certain destiny or fate, and you need to fulfill God's purpose and things like this. This isn't actually true. We all have free will. If we thought that God was controlling us and everything that we experience in life, then we're locked in. We have no ability to do anything. And what's interesting about this thought process, that sometimes people think God is controlling everything, sometimes people think that God is also judging you, and at the end of this life, you're going to a good place or bad place. Well, if God's controlling everything, and he's also judging you about whether you go to a good place or a bad place, it's not free will, right? Because he's controlling you. And why would he judge you for something that he's choosing himself? This is where you can see the confusion and the delusion and the misunderstanding about this being in the world, that God can't be controlling everything and at the same time judging you for those things and sending you to a good place or bad place because of the decisions that he made. It's just not possible. So we all have free will. That look at the clothes you're wearing. Did God force you to wear those? Look at the hairstyle that you have. Did God force you to have that hairstyle? Look at the place where you live. Did God force you to do that? Of course not, right? You made all these decisions yourself and you have free will. That's the way that this world is based on, is that each individual being has their own free will. We make our own decisions. And that's one of the things that makes us a living being, is that we are able to make our own decisions. So it's important that you don't think that you're locked in, that you have destiny, that you have fate, that God is controlling things, and that you see true reality, that you have free will, and that everything that you are experiencing in life is based on certain decisions that you are making, not the decisions that God's making. So if you thought that it was up to God to make decisions for your life, then why would you ever learn any wisdom to be able to improve your life? Because it's God making all the decisions. But this just isn't true. It's confusion, it's delusion, it's misunderstanding, it's misperception. So you would like to be able to see the truth that you're making all your own free will decisions. As I mentioned previously, God doesn't grant enlightenment. It's a practitioner through their own wholesome choices and decisions that is choosing to move towards enlightenment. This is why you can't force somebody to get to enlightenment. This is why you don't need to go out on the street corner and beat a drum and try to convince people with picket signs to come learn the teachings of the Buddha, because they need to choose to do these things. There's 1,000,001 decisions that someone needs to make in order to get to enlightenment. They need to make choices to come to the temple, choices to pick up the book, choices to read the book, choices to ask their teacher question, choices to meditate, choices to be friendly and kind to people around them. All these choices that we make, that's what's going to lead us to enlightenment. So you can't force somebody to get to enlightenment, and God isn't the one who grants enlightenment or forces or controls someone to get to enlightenment. We're making our own free will choices of whether or not we're going to walk towards the light and get to this wholesome mental state or not. And it's not God that determines that for us. We're actually determining it for ourselves based on our own decisions. So this is just a little bit of background on a definition of God. Again, it may be different than what you're thinking about God, but at least you'll understand where I'm coming from when I'm talking about this being. Okay, so the teachings of Gotama Buddha as it relates to God, there's a lot of misunderstanding about this in the world. If you spend any time on Facebook and Buddhist groups and things like this, you'll see all kinds of things. People will tell you that the Buddha denied the existence of God, or the Buddha rejected God. You'll see these really strong statements sometimes. This is just not true. If you go back and you look to the original source teachings in the Pali Canon, the Buddha references this being multiple times. He talks about this being. He just doesn't make God a central focus in his teachings, because it's not about a belief in God that's going to improve your life. What's going to improve your life is you cultivating wisdom. So instead of putting God at the center of his teachings, he puts you at the center of his teachings, that you need to learn and train and grow and develop. So the Buddha never denied the existence of God, but instead he taught people how to attain enlightenment with an understanding of God. Because during the Buddha's lifetime, they believed in multiple gods. So you can hear him talking about that, or you can see him talking about that in his teachings, that he talks about these different gods. But typically when he's talking about God, he's talking about the great Brahma. He's talking about the creator. He's talking about one God. But he's also talking about these multiple gods, because that's what people understood during that time frame, and he needed to help them to get to enlightenment based on their current understanding of this being and helping them evolve beyond that. So he didn't reject God. He actually does discuss God, and he discusses various gods that people believed in during that lifetime. Gotama Buddha's objective wasn't to either prove or disprove God's existence. Jesus comes later, about 500 years later, to try to convince everybody that there's only one God, because up to that point, people believed in multiple gods. And Jesus' objective was to prove to people that there was only one God. So he performed a whole bunch of miracles in order to convince people who he was. And then he said, hey, by the way, everyone, there's only one God, right? And he taught some other things too, but that's essentially his main objective, was to convince people that there was only one God. And by and large, he's accomplished that, because here we are about 2,000 years later, and the vast majority of the world, if they think about God, they think about just one. But there are, of course, people still in the world that think there's multiple gods. So the Buddha did teach about multiple gods, but his objective wasn't to prove or disprove God's existence. The way that a Buddha teaches is they teach things that are independently verifiable. And the way that God functions is he tends to not do things that are kind of proving to the masses that he exists. This all-knowing, all-powerful God, if he was truly interested in people knowing of his existence and fearing people into that, he could shake the entire earth. He could turn the sky purple and black and green and rain down lightning bolts. And he's got all this power to be able to do all these things, but he doesn't, because he's not interested in people fearing him, and he's not interested in shaking people up. So if he was interested in doing that, he surely could, but that's not what he does. He doesn't give that type of proof, where instead you can actually learn about this being and you can actually interact with this being, and you'll see this on a personal level. But it's challenging to be able to give you something that's independently verifiable, that you can go out into the world and independently verify that God either exists or doesn't exist. The only one thing that I've seen that you can potentially point to is look at the complexity of this earth and the planets and the way that it functions. This couldn't have happened from just two unintelligent rocks hitting each other. Oftentimes this is what we're taught, that there's this big bang, right, where these two rocks hit each other, and then poof, we got all this stuff that we have now. How could two unintelligent rocks hit each other and create all this complexity that we see in the world? It's just humanly impossible. So in my opinion, I agree with the Buddha that God is the creator, and there was this intelligence that went into place in order to create this amazing place that we all inhabit, and what we have beyond this, beyond earth as well. So the Buddha's teachings aren't based on belief. They're based on independently verifiable truth to acquire wisdom. And I will share with you things that you can independently verify. But in terms of independently verifying God's existence, if you're interested in doing that, you can look at what I just shared, or as you might choose to have a relationship with this being, and this being shows up in your life and you have communication with this being, or this being does things in order to show you that they exist, then you'll have independent confirmation. But it's not something that we have as by and large, where I can say, here's the universal truth of impermanence. You can independently verify that, or the universal truth of discontentedness, or the universal truth of non-self, or the Four Noble Truths. These are things that are easily independently verifiable, but something like God, it's not as easy, because he tends to do things on an individual basis. So therefore, there isn't a way to kind of send you out into the world to independently verify this. Unless you have a relationship with this being and you've experienced communication with this being, you may not have independently verified yet whether this being exists or they don't exist. So Gotama Buddha's teachings focus on a practitioner's mind getting to liberation, where it's have freedom from strong feelings. Enlightenment is based on right view. That right view is understanding that your mind is causing your own discontentedness. And part of right view is also understanding the natural law of karma, of cause and effect, or action and result. Getting to enlightenment isn't based on God's creative actions, because we all have free will. We have to make the free will choices. If this being God is a creator, and this being is controlling the world the way that some people think, we wouldn't enjoy living in that world. We would be like robots. Nobody would enjoy living in that world. And that's why this intelligent being, this all-knowing, all-powerful being, didn't create the world that way. They didn't create the world where that being is controlling. Even though that being could do that, this being doesn't do that, because we wouldn't enjoy living in that kind of world. So this being doesn't control us. We all have free will. So us getting to enlightenment is not based on a belief in this being. It's not even based on having a relationship with this being. If you're interested in having a relationship with this being, you can, and this being will help you, but you don't have to. You can get to enlightenment without a relationship with this being as well. So Gotama Buddha's teachings do talk about God, but he doesn't make God the central focus of his teachings. Here's one of those teachings from the Buddha about God, but in this teaching helps you to understand that you have free will. But there's a whole litany of other teachings, particularly in volume 11, where the Buddha is talking about God, but they also show up in some of the other volumes as well. So here, the Buddha, this one is titled, All is Caused by God's Creative Action. Then, monks, I approach those ascetics and Brahmins who hold such a doctrine in view as this: whatever this person experiences, whether pleasure, pain, or neither pain nor pleasure, all that is caused by God's creative activity. And I said to them, is it true that you venerable ones hold such a doctrine in view? Okay, so I'm going to pause there for a moment. We might think that during the lifetime of the Buddha that he was the only one teaching, but in reality, there were multiple people teaching. It wasn't just him. People didn't know that he was necessarily a Buddha unless they studied with him and they could see the clarity of his teachings. They could understand that it was helping their mind, and they understood his background, that he didn't have any teachers or any guides. They would know that he's a Buddha, but not everybody knew that he was a Buddha. So there were other people around that were teaching and sharing teachings, and those teachers and those students would sometimes intermingle with the Buddha or the Buddha students, and they would kind of compare notes and talk about things. Just like you guys, probably when you go to retreats, you probably talk about the things that you've learned here versus the things you've learned other places. And there's probably other students that talk to you about things. It's the same thing that goes on now that went on back then. So the Buddha was coming in contact with other teachers and other students of other teachers. And here he says to them, he says that these people, these ascetics and Brahmin, have the view that their discontentedness is caused by God. And he's asking them, is that true? Right? So he says, whatever this person experiences, whether pleasure, pain, or neither pain nor pleasure, meaning the anger, the sadness, the frustration, the happiness, the excitement, all of that is caused by God's creative activity. And I said to them, is it true that you guys hold this doctrine in view, that God's the one who causes you to be discontented? Is that what you think? Is that your opinion and your view, that God is the one who's causing your discontentedness? When I asked them this, they affirm it. I mean, they said, yes, God's the one who causes us to be discontent. These people that he was talking to, they said, yeah, God's the one who causes my anger. God's the one who causes my frustration. God's the one who causes my shyness and my resentment. Then I say to them, in such a case, it is due to God's creative activity that you might destroy life, take what is not given, indulge in sexual activity, speak falsehood, produce argumentative speech, speak harshly, indulge in idle chatter, that you might be full of longing, which is craving, desire, attachment, have a mind of ill will, which is anger, hatred, ill will, and hold wrong view, which is have ignorance, right? He's saying, is it because of God that you do all these unwholesome things? Is it because of God because you have craving, anger, and ignorance? It's because of God? That's what you're saying? And then he says to them, those who fall back on God's creative activity as the essential truth have no interest to do what should be done or to avoid doing what should not be done, nor do they make an effort in this respect. So what he's saying is, if you're blaming God for all the discontentedness that you experience, if you're blaming God for you killing and stealing and having sexual misconduct and lying and being argumentative and having craving, anger, and ignorance, then you're not even interested in improving your life. You're not even interested in doing what would be wise and helpful and wholesome, because you're blaming God for the things that you're experiencing. So he's saying those who fall back on God's creative activity as an essential truth have no interest to do what should be done, meaning doing what needs to be done in order to improve your mind and improve the condition of your mind and getting to enlightenment, and to avoid doing what should not be done. They do not make an effort in this respect. In other words, these people don't think that they have free will. These people think that God's controlling everything and they don't have free will. So the Buddha is saying, because you think you don't have free will, you're not even willing to do what should be done and not do what should not be done. You don't have the wisdom and you don't have the inspiration, the enthusiasm, the ambition to improve your life, because everything you're experiencing is based on God. So then he finishes up, he says, since they do not apprehend as true and valid anything that should be done or should not be done, They are muddle-minded, meaning they have a lack of concentration in their mind because their mind's polluted with all these pollutions of craving, anger, and ignorance. They do not guard themselves, meaning that they're not guarding their mind with mindfulness. Whenever the Buddha is talking about a guard, it means mindfulness, that you need to guard your mind with mindfulness. So they're not guarding their mind. They're just assuming that God's the one who's causing the anger, so they're not using mindfulness to guard the mind and cut it off and let it go. They're just allowing the anger and the sadness and frustration to come into their mind. And even the personal designation aesthetic could not be legitimately applied to them. What it means to be an aesthetic is that you've given up your worldly life, you've entered this life of homelessness, and you're now on the path to enlightenment. So what the Buddha is saying is that if you think that God's the one who's controlling everything in your life and you don't have free will, you're not even on the path to enlightenment. That's what he's saying, is that you're not even on the first step on the path to enlightenment because you think God's controlling you and controlling everything you're experiencing. So you're not even trying to get to enlightenment because you think God's the one who's forcing you to kill and steal and have argumentative speech and all these other things. You haven't even understood that what you're experiencing is based on your decisions. So what he's talking to is a bunch of people that don't have right view. They have wrong view. And he's saying you're not even on the path to enlightenment because you haven't established right view yet. So if we walked around with the idea that God was controlling everything and we don't have free will, you're not even on the path to enlightenment yet, is what the Buddha is saying. So this is just one teaching about God, where the Buddha teaches other things where he talks about God as being the creator and all these other things. But I'm just sharing this one with you so that you can understand that you do have free will, and that you can also understand that the Buddha taught about God, because people think that the Buddha rejected God and the Buddha rejected his existence. And he said that the God doesn't exist, but this isn't actually true. The Buddha taught about God. It's just that people haven't studied his original teachings, so they think that he hasn't taught about God. So you can go through this book series and you can see where the Buddha teaches about God being the creator and the all-knowing and the all-powerful and all these other things. Okay? So with the Buddha's teachings, he has what's called the undeclared teachings. And I mentioned this the other day, that the Buddha has a discourse where he says, "Remember, monks, what did I teach? I taught this." And he describes the Four Noble Truths. He says, I taught what is discontentedness, I taught the cause of discontentedness, I taught the elimination of discontentedness, and I taught the path forward to eliminating discontentedness. Remember what I taught this. But then he also says in that same discourse, remember what I did not teach. I did not teach this. And these are the 10 things that he didn't teach. He didn't teach whether the world is eternal or whether the world is not eternal. Because oftentimes we're taught in teachings related to God, we've taught that the world is eternal and the ultimate goal is to get to eternal life. But the Buddha never taught whether the world is eternal or it isn't eternal. He just left it as an undeclared teaching. He also didn't teach whether the world is finite or infinite. He didn't teach that the soul is the same as the body, or the soul is one thing and the body is another. He never taught about a soul. He left it as an undeclared teaching because the concept of a soul conflicts with the universal truth of impermanence, and it conflicts with the universal truth of non-self. So he just left it as an undeclared teaching. He didn't teach whether there is a soul or there isn't a soul. Then he says, after death, the Tathagata exists. The Tathagata is him. That's how he would refer to himself. The Tathagata is him. The word Tathagata means the one who's discovered the truth, or the one who shares the truth. So he's saying after death, the Tathagata exists. He left that as an undeclared teaching, whether he exists after he dies. So whether an enlightened being exists after death, he left it as an undeclared teaching. Because as the Tathagata, as a Buddha, he's an arahant. He's eliminated the 10 fetters. So you could replace the word Tathagata here with enlightened being. That after death, an enlightened being exists. He left this as an undeclared teaching. But also, after death, an enlightened being does not exist. He left that as an undeclared teaching as well. After death, the Tathagata both exists and does not exist. That's an undeclared teaching. And after death, the Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist. So this is a way of basically saying, I'm not teaching what comes after enlightenment. Once you get to enlightenment and die, it's an undeclared teaching. I'm not sharing that. And I have various reasons why I think he did that. And like I've mentioned to you before, we can talk about those if you like. I have them in the book series where I explain my thoughts on why the Buddha might not have taught this. But he leaves it as an undeclared teaching. So the ultimate goal of the teachings of the Buddha isn't to believe a bunch of things and then live this eternal life with God in heaven. That's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to get to enlightenment and escape this cycle of rebirth. And you can see this here through his undeclared teachings, that he's not declaring whether the world is eternal or not eternal. He's not even declaring what happens to you after death. He's not declaring anything about a soul or anything like this. It's all an undeclared teaching. But by the time you get to enlightenment, your mind is so peaceful and so joyful, you're not going to care whether there's something next or not. If there is, okay, it's either as good as what you're currently experiencing or better. And if there isn't anything after death for an enlightened being, okay, so be it. You're already peaceful and joyful in the present moment. So this is ultimately why you need to eliminate any particular craving or desire for an afterlife, because sometimes that's what people have in their mind, is they're craving an afterlife. You need to get to the point where in the present moment, you're completely peaceful and joyful in the present moment. What may or may not happen in the future after death, yet to be determined. Get to enlightenment first, and then you'll see for yourself. But get to the point where your mind is enlightened, you'll be so peaceful and joyful that it doesn't matter what's next. If there's anything next, there may or may not be anything next. The Buddha didn't declare it. Okay, so these are his undeclared teachings, and you can see this discourse, the entire discourse in the book series. But here, I just extracted the 10 things that he taught that are undeclared. Okay? Do you guys have any questions up to this point? Yes, sir.
Thank you, David. Obviously, a lot of rabbit holes you could go down, but just to clarify my understanding. So this being, God, created this realm of existence that I'm living in. This realm of existence is governed by the laws of karma. Full stop. Even though this being could intervene, this being won't intervene, because this realm of existence is governed by the laws of karma. And therefore, to escape, to get to the path of enlightenment, follow the teachings based on the universal truth for, blah, 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 full stop. And therefore, as you say, it's not critical whether I say, well, yes, God did create this universe, so therefore I'll follow the teachings based on the laws of karma, Four Noble Truths, etc., etc. Well, actually, I don't know, I don't care what created this. It's still governed by the laws of karma. That's it.
Right. You got it. Yep. And I'm going to teach you how to do that as we go forward here. This is just a pause to make sure you guys are on the page of understanding what it is that I'm sharing. And then after this, I'm going to now teach you more about this being of God.
And just sort of one kind of related questions is the concept of prayer. Often we pray, or, in different traditions, pray to this higher being. Now, obviously, if I was praying for God to intervene to change something without me making the effort, that's a waste of time, because that's against the laws. I get that. But
it's a craving too.
Yes, that's how it's a craving. But can prayer feed into right intention in a way?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking about here in a moment about prayer, because oftentimes we've been taught to kind of treat God like a genie in a bottle. And like we're going to get these wishes like, God, please change things in my life. Make me rich, make me wealthy, get my boyfriend back, get my girlfriend back. It's almost like treating God like a genie in a bottle. And if the mind is doing that, then the mind's not understanding that this is a craving, desire, attachment. The mind's longing, yearning for something. In that situation where you're praying to God, asking God to change things, you're also not understanding the natural law of karma, that everything that you experience is related to your decisions of cause and effect. So the mind is still having wrong view in that situation. So there is the ability to pray, but the type of prayer that I'm going to show you about, if somebody does choose to pray, it needs to be void of wishes and please do this for me and do that for me, because that's not what this being does. They don't intervene on your behalf and fix certain things that you've made unwise decisions about. Mm-hmm. You guys have some mics? You guys have questions? Mm-hmm.
Testing. Yeah, I'm kind of interested. I like the conversation and the idea. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the why Gotama Buddha didn't teach those kind of big questions of like what happens after arahantship.
Sure. So let's just say there is something next, right? And let's just say that the Buddha knew that he knew that something was next. If he taught that, and let's just say it's something really grand and really wonderful, if he taught that, then the individual to get to enlightenment would need to eliminate any kind of craving for that thing in order to get to enlightenment. So he would be teaching something where he's introducing a potential for the mind to actually crave this thing. So you have enough cravings to get rid of. To introduce one more thing that you have to get rid of, in my opinion, that would be unwise. And a Buddha is very wise, so he wisely didn't teach if there is something next, okay? That would be one reason why he might not have taught it. The second reason is there might not be anything next, right? This could be a particular thing too, and we need to make sure we're not craving that. A third thing could be that he didn't know what was next, right? Because maybe the way that a Buddha teaches is they only teach things that they've experienced themselves. If they've experienced it, they will teach it because they know it's the truth. If they haven't experienced it, they won't teach it. So he may not have known what was next because he never had gotten to enlightenment and died before. Nobody has ever done that, or they've gotten to enlightenment, died, but they haven't come back into the world, right? Because they wouldn't come back into the world. So that was the first time he had gotten to enlightenment, and he never experienced death. So he may not have known what was next because he had never experienced it for himself. But a Buddha does have the ability to know things without having experienced it. So he may have, if there is something next, he may have known, and he just wisely chose not to teach it. So these could all be reasons why he chose not to teach, is either there isn't anything next and he just chose not to teach it, or there is something next and it's so wonderful and so great he knew people would just be craving it, so he just wisely didn't teach it. Or it could be that he had never experienced it, and because he never experienced it, he didn't actually teach it. Because the Buddha only teaches things that they experience because they know that this is the truth. And if I experienced it, other people will experience it too. So I can be confident that I can teach this same thing and people can independently verify it. So he may not have taught it because he never experienced it, and he didn't know the truth of what was truly going to happen next. But a Buddha does have the ability to know things without having experienced it. But they typically will not teach it unless they've experienced it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kushi, you have a question? Or two or three?
Yeah, so I wanted to know, so the God is not in a heavenly being. Is that what we are saying here? Or
God is not a heavenly being, but he's associated with the heavenly realm. So there are heavenly beings, but then there's this being of God, which is a unique being. There's only one in the world, and it's the all-knowing and all-powerful, but he's typically associated with the heavenly realm, but he wouldn't be referred to as a heavenly being, because a heavenly being is just kind of like an average being in the heavenly realm, where God isn't that just kind of average being. He's this unique being that is all-knowing and all-powerful.
right, so in Hinduism, it's taught that they pray to heavenly beings, and there are different realms in heaven. And so, I thought the God is also a part of the higher realm in heavenly being.
Yeah, so the Buddha taught multiple heavenly. So we talk about a heavenly realm. He talked about kind of subcategories within the heavenly realm. And he did the same thing with the hell realm too. He talks about many subcategories within the hell realm. Nowadays, we tend to think of it as just hell and heaven. We don't think about the subcategories. But during the lifetime of the Buddha, they did teach subcategories within heaven and within hell as well. But this is what we refer to as a cosmology. A cosmology is how people think about these various realms and things like this. In order to get to enlightenment, you don't have to understand the cosmology that existed during the lifetime of the Buddha in terms of all the subcategories of realms, but you do need to be able to understand the 5 realms, that there's a heavenly realm, human realm, the afflicted spirit realm, the animal realm, and the hell realm. But all the subcategories, you don't need to understand those. But the Buddha does teach as God is part of one of these subcategories of the heavenly realm, because he subcategorizes it into multiple subcategories, and he associates with this one particular aspect of heaven, and that's where God exists. But nowadays we tend to think of heaven as just all one realm, and God is associated with that particular realm.
Right. So I think it's the Brahma world where Brahma resides.
Mm-hmm.
But so other heavenly beings have also got the powers, but not as much as Brahma, is what you're saying. And so if people pray to God, then the God is not fulfilling their wishes, as to say. But if God does something, it's just for letting people know of his existence. So if people are worshipping this other heavenly beings, what is the impact or going over there?
Worshipping any beings is problematic because the mind is having wrong view in that situation, thinking that if I worship these beings, that these beings are going to do something on my behalf. And this isn't going to lead one to understanding the natural law of karma, and that we need to cultivate wisdom and make wise decisions. So the ramifications of that is that the mind's still having wrong view, and it's not seeing the natural law of karma. So therefore, they're not going to be able to experience enlightenment as long as they think worshiping these heavenly beings or even God, they may think that these things are going to result in beneficial outcomes, but in reality it's not going to do that, because those beings, if they're interested in doing something on our behalf, they're going to do it. This all-knowing, all-powerful God, he already knows every single thing that's going to transpire from the beginning of time all the way to the end of time. If there's an end of time, he knows every single thing, every single being that is either has been in existence, is in existence now, will be in existence in the future. He knows everything that's going to transpire. He knew that you were going to ask me this question at the beginning of time, because this being is the all-knowing, all-powerful. So this all-knowing, all-powerful being, if they're interested in doing something, they're going to do it on their own. They don't need us to crave it and long and yearn for it and pray for it and ask for it and worship this being in order for this being to do things. Just like you know, if you're going to do something nice for your brother, you're just going to do something nice for your brother because that's your choice. The same thing about this being of God. If God's going to do something, he's just going to do it. But this being doesn't just step into our life and control us and tell us what to do or force us what to do or fix things that we messed up. That's not the way this being functions. But oftentimes the way that the mind thinks in the unenlightened state is that as a parent, for example, if a parent sees their child headed for danger, a parent might feel like they need to step in and fix that in order to stop that child from experiencing the danger. And somebody might think that that's showing love. So because that's the way a human being functions, they oftentimes think that that's the way God should function. That if we're headed for danger, if God truly loves us, God should step in and stop us from doing those things. But this isn't actually the way that this being functions, because that's not what's going to help us to cultivate wisdom. If this being was just constantly restraining us, then we never get to cultivate the wisdom of what's wise and unwise, because we're being controlled by this other being. So this being of God, you can't worship this being and then get favoritism from this being to be able to do things that are going to be beneficial for you. Everything you experience is a result of the decisions that you make, not from this being. You have more?
Yeah, so what about the other heavenly beings? Do they do this stuff too, or they are just in their lives doing their things?
Let me get through these questions, and then I'm going to talk more about what God does and how we can have a relationship with him, and then I'll talk about how to not have a relationship with God and get to enlightenment, and then you'll be able to ask those questions if I don't already answer them for you, because you need to know more about what God does, because that's where your questions are headed.
Okay, all right.
Mm-hmm. Leo, you have some questions?
Okay. Yeah, I think first, isn't it understandable that people are angry about God because He created the world and is all-knowing, so He knew that there are billions of years for new existences. So I thought about where is the love and kindness, and is there a happy end why He's doing this, or but at the end everybody is so peaceful, and or what is the goal of all this suffering over billions of years in hell or something?
So you said, isn't it understandable that people are angry with God? What causes anger? What's that? Craving and ignorance? Yeah, craving for sure, right? And then because of the ignorance, the craving continues, right? So that's what's causing the anger, right? The mind is craving for God to be a certain way, and people want God to function a certain way. And when He doesn't function that way, they're going to get angry, right? And God's not going to function the way that everybody wants Him to function. God's going to function the way that God knows to be wise to function. Where, using this analogy of the parent stepping in and restraining the child, well, if you've had children, well, I know you haven't had children, but for those of you guys that have children, you might know that, yeah, when you have a toddler and they're going towards the stove, you pull them back and you say, no, this is hot. Don't touch this. This is going to burn you. This is going to hurt you. And you start to try to give them wisdom, and they keep going to the stove and they keep going to the stove, and you keep restraining them and you keep restraining them. Well, this is what I did with my son. But eventually, when I started seeing him kept going to the stove, I actually let him go one day. I let him go over to the stove, and he got close to it and he felt the heat. And when he felt the heat, he was like, whoa. And then he never touched the stove again. So I could sit there and I could keep trying to restrain him and restrain him and restrain him. And I could try to teach him the wisdom, but it just wasn't working. So at a certain point, I just let him walk towards the stove, and I knew he wasn't going to get, fatally injured, but I let him walk towards the stove. I let him feel the heat. And from that point forward, he's never done that again, because he got the wisdom. He got it, right? He awoke to that wisdom right away. So if God constantly restrained us from doing all these harmful things, we would never cultivate the wisdom that we need, and we would essentially be controlled by this being, constantly controlled by this being. Every time we try to do something unwise, they would restrain us, and they would restrain us. We'd like, man, what you doing, man? Like, hey, come on, give me free will. What's going on? Why are you trying to control me, right? So this being doesn't step in and stop us from doing something unwise. And the thing is that oftentimes when parents do that with children, it's because they would have painful feelings if they saw their child suffer, because they're attached to their child. So in that situation, I wasn't attached to my son. I knew what he needed was to cultivate wisdom. And while I tried to help him a few times, ultimately the best way to help him cultivate wisdom is go ahead and go do it. And I've done this with other things in his life too. There were times in our village, there were some friends that my wife and I knew that he was headed for difficulties and struggles with these friends, and we advised him and we said, hey, these friends, we're not so sure that you should hang out with them. You guys are going to run into some problems. And he was like, no, these are good guys. I'm going to spend time with them. We're like, all right, go ahead. You spend time with them. That's what you'd like to do. And within a few months, they stole his helmet. They dumped some water over his head. They hit him on the head with a bucket. They did all these different things, and he stopped hanging out with those kids on his own, as his own wise choice. So as parents, a wise way to do things would be, in some situations, you need to just let your kid do that thing that they're interested in doing so that they can cultivate the wisdom, and then they can learn themselves. And one of the things that I've noticed with my son now, having gone through that experience, is that he knows how to select wise friends now. That when he's been to 3 different schools, and he knows how to select friends that are into wholesome things. He tends to not associate with people who are into unwholesome things. And he had to learn that through his own experience, because mom and dad could try to teach him that all day long, but he wasn't understanding, and he wasn't making the decisions that we knew to be wise. But once he experienced these unwholesome results based on his unwise decisions, then he saw the truth. So God is the same way. God is this wise parent, and we could think of it that way, that is allowing us to make our own decisions And now we cultivate wisdom as a result of that. And then this being doesn't have to constantly control us. But oftentimes people want this being to control us. When we talk about God creating the world, it doesn't mean that God's controlling the world. So sometimes when we see a murder or a rape or a child gets abused, sometimes people say, how could God allow this to occur? Well, God's not the one who's causing that to occur. It's that person that's choosing to abuse that child. It's that person that's choosing to rape or murder. It's not God that's choosing that. It's that person that's doing it. And people think that, well, if this being God is so loving and kind and compassionate, wouldn't they step in and stop that from occurring? Well, now that being is controlling the world. If they did that, they would be controlling every single aspect about the world. And now we don't like the world because we don't have free will. So this being is not attached to us, right? If a parent is attached to their child, they might think the way to solve the problem of this child is to constantly restrain the child. But you're not actually going to solve the problem, because if you understand what the problem is in the unenlightened mind, it's a lack of wisdom. That's the problem, is the lack of wisdom. That's why my son kept trying to touch the stove, because he had a lack of wisdom. He didn't understand the stove's hot and it's going to hurt if you touch it. I understood that, but he didn't understand it. He was too young, right? So when you understand the problem is a lack of wisdom, you try to help your children to cultivate wisdom. And sometimes they will listen, sometimes they will understand, sometimes they will cultivate that wisdom and make improved decisions. Other times, you need to just let them touch the hot stove. And that's the best way for them to get wisdom. And God does the same thing, as you're going to hear me say, is God can actually give you guidance on the path to enlightenment. He can actually help you. He's helped me tremendously on this path. But you don't have to receive that guidance. You don't have to have that relationship with God. So you can receive guidance from God, and you can cultivate wisdom, but God's not going to restrain us. And if people get angry about God, this is because of their craving. They're having a certain craving, a longing, a yearning for God to be a certain way, and he's not that way, and therefore they become angry and frustrated. But God's not attached to us. He would like to see us do wonderful things in the world, but it's up to our decisions to do that. It's not up to him to choose for us what we should or shouldn't do.
Because he also created craving, attachment, and so on, right? So he did it. So don't understand why this many billions of years of suffering. So I don't understand why he did this, but
so this is from the mindset of, it's God's fault. It's God that's doing this. It's God that's created our suffering. God's not creating our suffering. What's creating our suffering is the craving, desire, attachment. That's what's in the mind. And we can choose to eliminate it, right? Sometimes people think, well, if this God's really loving and all so compassionate, wouldn't he make us preloaded with enlightenment? Wouldn't we be born enlightened? That's okay, well, I've done everything for you, and now you just come into the world and you're going to have this wonderful life. But this isn't the way that this being created the world. The way that this being created the world is that we need to do some work. We can't be complacent. We need to actually do something to contribute to this society. Whereas if we were already peaceful from birth, what motivation would we have to improve and cultivate wisdom? What fun would that be? That it would be better for us to learn and grow and develop. I don't know about you, but I enjoy learning. I enjoy cultivating wisdom. I'm pleased that I have this ability to think my own way, to have my own free will, that he didn't preload a bunch of software on my mind to make me think a certain way, that he's given me this free will to be able to figure it out for myself. And that's enjoyable. Whereas if I came preloaded with a bunch of software to think a certain way, I wouldn't like that. I don't think you would either.
Why a billion years?
What's that?
Why a billion years for that?
Why what?
A billion years.
A billion years?
Yeah.
You mean the Earth has been here for 4.5 billion years?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, why so long? New existence.
You'll have to ask.
Learn this wisdom.
You have to ask.
Why not one existence and you can get the wisdom?
The only reason why you've been through so many existences is because you haven't taken the time to cultivate the wisdom. It's not God that's choosing that for you. That's your choices. You could have gotten wisdom in your past lives if you were human, but you just didn't do that. That was your choices, not God's. And this is one of the things that the mind needs to get away from if they're going to have a relationship with God, is to not blame God for the things that you're experiencing in this life. Not that you're overly blaming God, but there's kind of that undertone that oftentimes people will ask these kinds of questions and think like, gosh, why am I here? It's because of God. He's the creator. God's the one who's causing my suffering. But if you resign yourself to that thinking, then you're not having right view and being able to see that it's within your own mind, and it's within your own power to be able to escape all of this. And God's given you the ability to do that. You can stay in this life of darkness and misery. He didn't create that life. Each one of us create that life. And he also didn't create this wonderful life. You've got to create it. He's allowing you to create whatever type of life you like. You can create this dark life. You can create this bright light where your mind is enlightened. It's up to you to decide for yourself. He's not forcing you or controlling you to either stay in the darkness or to walk towards the light. He's just providing you the opportunity to be able to do whatever it is that you would like to do. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go on, because I think you guys are going to be interested in understanding more about this being, and this is what I have here. Based on things that we've oftentimes been taught in the past, we oftentimes have misunderstandings of this being, and it can hinder us from having a healthy relationship. So a relationship with God isn't required to attain enlightenment, like I've said, but it also won't hinder you either. Sometimes people think that having a relationship with God would hinder you from getting to enlightenment. The only way it would hinder you from getting to enlightenment is if your mind held on to the conditioning in the false truths and the misunderstandings that you might have been taught in other venues. So the first thing to learn and understand in relationship to this God is practicing right view. Practicing right view is to take responsibility for the things that you're experiencing in life. To blame God for the things that we experience in life would be wrong view. It's just like blaming your neighbor or blaming your life partner or blaming your children for the things that you experience. God is just one more being that oftentimes the unenlightened mind will tend to blame for the things that we experience. And if we do that, you don't have right view at that point, and therefore you're going to be hindered in being able to improve the condition of your mind in your life. You need to be empowered and take responsibility for your own life, and that's what's going to lead to improvement in your life. God and the elimination of craving in the mind. Oftentimes we've been taught that God is like this genie in a bottle, and that we should pray to God, and that, worship God, and God's going to, make everything better for us, and that it's God that's the one who's deciding everything for us. So if you're in prayer and you're praying to this being of God and asking God to change things about your life, this is craving, desire, attachment. And you wouldn't be able to have a healthy relationship with this being if you had this. Because, for example, say your mom gets sick and she's in the hospital, and you sit down and you pray to God. Please, God, make her healthy. Please, 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 please perform a miracle and make her healthy. If you did this and your mom dies, yeah, you might be angry at God. You might hate God because you think that he didn't intervene on your behalf. But that's not what God does. God doesn't intervene. The reason why our mom is sick is because her body is impermanent. She's sick because she's impermanent. She was born, so therefore she has to die. But our mind craving our mom to be permanently healthy, now when God doesn't do that for us, we're angry at God, right? Perhaps. So essentially what we're asking God to do is to basically circumvent these natural laws and intervene on our behalf, because it's so important for us that our mom stays alive for a long time or permanently. And that's not what God does. So if we go to God with these prayers of craving for either our mother to be alive or to be rich and wealthy or any of these other things, it's like treating God like a genie in a bottle. And when the mind doesn't get what it wants, it's going to get angry. It's going to get frustrated. So there's some people in the world that are very angry at God. And the reason why is because they have craving for God to do something for them, not realizing that that's not what God does. Everything that we experience is a result of our decisions, and God's not a genie in a bottle. So if we have a bunch of cravings wanting God to do a certain thing for us and he doesn't do it, then we'll be angry and frustrated. Just like your neighbor. If you had a craving for your neighbor to cut their grass every week, or you had a craving for your neighbor to do a particular thing, if they didn't do those things, you'd be angry at your neighbor. It's the same thing with God. Because we know God is the all-knowing, all-powerful, we think that God should somehow intervene on our behalf. But this isn't what God does. He's not going to circumvent the natural laws of existence on our behalf. That's not what God does. Instead, you can understand that God is this being in heaven, and having any kind of craving to be with God in heaven is also going to lead to discontentedness. So not only do we need to eliminate craving, desire, attachment as it relates to prayer, but eliminating craving, desire, attachment as it relates to being with God in heaven. Because this is what oftentimes we're taught, is that the ultimate goal of this life is to worship God, believe in God, and because of doing that, now when we die, we'll have this afterlife of eternal life with God. And that's what some people are taught. So you're going to need to eliminate that attachment, that craving that I want to be with God at the end of this life, because that's still a craving, and it's going to keep you stuck in this constant cycle of rebirth, right? So you need to eliminate any kind of craving to be with God. So maybe you've been with God in the past. Maybe you can be with God now. Maybe you can fulfill that craving through just understanding that God is all around you at all times. But if you have a craving to be with God after death, then your mind's not going to actually get to enlightenment, and you'll just stay stuck in this constant cycle, and the discontentedness will continue. Any kind of craving or attachment to God in terms of wanting God to do a particular thing, this is the craving that needs to be eliminated, where you just understand that this being is on its own, making its own decisions, and whatever you choose or whatever you decide, it's your decisions. But having expectations of this being to be a certain way is just going to hinder you from having a healthy relationship with this being, if that's what you choose to do, because this being isn't going to function the way you want them to function. Just like you might have craving for your mom or your dad or brothers or sisters to be a certain way. If they're not that way, you'll get angry and you'll have difficulties having a healthy relationship. The same thing is true with this being. If you want this being to be a certain way and they're not that way, you won't have a healthy relationship with them. You'll be frustrated and angry and irritated at them. God in the natural law of karma, understanding that anything that happens in your life is a result of your decisions. Sometimes people think that you're being punished or you're being rewarded by God. So if you get a new job, someone might say, oh, thank you, God, thank you so much. Or even when somebody eats food, they might sit down and thank God for this food. God didn't give you that food. You earned that food. You went out and worked, and you went to the store, you purchased that food, and you're sitting down and eating it. It's not God who gave that to you. That was the cause and effect, or action and result. That was your karma that you were able to produce that food. So if you get a new job, or you get more money, or you get a boyfriend or girlfriend, or you get food, this isn't coming from God. It's coming from your decisions. This is the wholesome results of your decisions. So it's not God that's punishing us or rewarding us. If anything, you're punishing yourself. If you're experiencing unwholesome results in your life, these are from your decisions. So your own decisions are punishing you, not God. So you need to be able to understand and see clearly this natural law of karma, of cause and effect, right? So that's the true reality of it. And even Jesus taught this. Oftentimes people don't understand, because a lot of times people learn about God through Jesus Christ's teachings. Jesus Christ taught you reap what you sow. That's the natural law of karma, of cause and effect. You reap what you sow, meaning whatever decisions you make, you're going to experience the results of those. That's what Jesus Christ said. You reap what you sow. He's teaching the natural law of karma. He's just not calling it the natural law of karma. But him and the Buddha taught the same thing. They're just using different cultural descriptions of this particular thing. You're going to need to eliminate any fear of God. Like we were talking about earlier, an enlightened being has no fear whatsoever. Sometimes when people think God is punishing them and rewarding them, they're taught to fear God because they think God's wrath is going to rain down on them. And anytime you do anything unwise, that God's going to punish you. If you had fear of this being, you wouldn't be able to have a healthy relationship with this being. Just like if you had a boyfriend or girlfriend, if you feared them, you wouldn't be able to have a healthy relationship. Just imagine every time your life partner comes home from work, you have fear of them. if you had fear of your life partner or your children or your teacher, you wouldn't be able to have a healthy relationship with someone that you feared. So God's not teaching you to fear him, even though other people are trying to teach you to maybe fear God. It's unwise to have fear of this being, because this being isn't doing anything to you. This being isn't punishing you or rewarding you. So there's no need to fear this being, because this being has nothing but love and kindness and compassion in their mind and in their heart. But oftentimes people are taught to fear this being because they think that it's this being that's punishing them, when in reality it's their own decisions that are leading to any particular result, either wholesome or unwholesome. But they're perceiving that as being God. So they might been taught to fear this being, but you don't need to fear this being. This being is not going to cause any harm to you whatsoever. No harm whatsoever. Anything harmful that comes to you, it's from your decisions. It's not from God. So there's no need to fear this particular being. So sometimes people ask me, well, okay, if I'm not praying to God and asking God for to do things in my life, and I don't need to worship God and I don't need to fear God, then what's the real purpose of God? What's God doing? Why is he even here? What's his purpose? Well, you might think about God as a practitioner of these teachings, right? If God created these natural laws, then surely this being is enlightened. This being is enlightened, right? Their mind is peaceful and joyful, just like I share, right? They're all knowing, all powerful. They understand these teachings very deeply. They're a practitioner of these teachings, but they're not attached to us, and they're not responsible. This being God is not responsible to restrain us. So when we're doing things that are unwise in the world, this being's not going to just pull us back. Same thing when I'm out with you guys. If I see you guys doing something unwise, I'm not going to restrain you. That's not my job. It's your job to cultivate wisdom and restrain yourself. If you could only make wise decisions when somebody's restraining you, then that means when you're out there on your own, you're going to get into all kinds of trouble, because the only time you can make wise decisions is when you're with a teacher or when you're with your parents. So if you could only make wise decisions when you're with your parents, when you're out there on your own, you're not going to be able to make wise decisions, and it's going to produce unwholesome results. So this being knows that. This being is wise. They're not going to just restrain you because you're not cultivating wisdom. One of the best ways to cultivate wisdom is to see your unwholesome karma coming back to you. The natural law of karma is the best, most unbiased teacher, because when you're making unwise decisions and you see that unwholesome result coming back to you, that will teach you. You will gain wisdom from that. Whereas if somebody constantly restrains you from the unwholesome things that you were doing, and you don't get to see the unwholesome results, then you're not going to be able to see the natural law of karma. So like my son, when he's on school break like this, he will sometimes stay awake until 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Even the other day, my wife told me he was awake until 3:50 a.m. in the morning, right? And she doesn't like this, that he's awake so late. I told her, I said, let him stay awake. Then he wakes up the next day and he's feeling groggy and he's feeling miserable. He'll learn for himself that it's unwise to go to sleep that late. So right now, if that's what he's choosing to do, I said, he's on school break, just let him do it, right? But there are some times, like he needed to get a vaccine the other day, so we made sure that he went to bed at a reasonable time because he was about to get this vaccine, and we incentivized and we said, hey, you're about to get this vaccine, we suggest you go to bed at this time. And he agreed, and he went to sleep at that time, but it was his choice, right? So a parent teaching a child, oftentimes we try to force and control our children to do things a certain way, and we think that that's what God should do for us, that God should force us and control us. But this isn't a healthy relationship. Think about the times that your parents tried to control you. You didn't like it at all, right? You revolted from that. You wouldn't like living in a world where God was constantly controlling us. So God's not attached to us. If we experience painful feelings, he doesn't experience painful feelings because of that. But for a parent who's attached to their child, when their child's experiencing painful feelings, they will experience painful feelings. And they think the way to solve this is to stop the child from doing that thing. But the thing that solves this is eliminating your attachment to your child. When you eliminate your attachment to your child, you're completely comfortable with them staying up to 3:50 a.m. in the morning, and then when they feel miserable the next day and they're groggy and laying on the floor and they can't even really do things the next day, I'm just smiling because it's like, yeah, he's getting his unwholesome karma. I'm pleased with that. because now he can see the lack of wisdom that he had in the unwise decisions that he made. I'm not happy that he's droggy and laying on the floor like the way he does when he stays awake really late, but at least he's experiencing his Gotama. If I constantly restrain him and say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, it's just going to make him want to do it more. Right? That's the way we were, right? When we were growing up and our parents constantly restrained us from something, the more they restrained us, the more we wanted to do that thing, right? So if God restrained us, if he was attached to us and he constantly restrained us, the more we would be interested in doing that thing. So by him not being attached to us, that when we experience painful feelings, he's like, okay, they're cultivating wisdom. This is the choice that they're making. Right? So he's not attached to us and trying to control us or restrain us in any particular way. He is interested in seeing all beings live in harmony, but they need to do that through acquiring wisdom. God's not the one that can produce harmony for us. Sometimes we're taught that God should be able to snap his fingers and instantly create harmony in the world. If he's the all-knowing and all-powerful, he should be able to snap his fingers and everybody lives in harmony. But in order to do that, we would all have to have the wisdom to be able to know how to do that. Because if God snapped his fingers and the world was perfect instantly, within a matter of seconds, we'd be right back into misery because we don't have the wisdom. We haven't cultivated the wisdom to be able to make wise decisions. So because of the natural law of Gotama, if we don't have wisdom, we're going to make unwise decisions that lead to unwholesome results. So while this being is the all-knowing and all-powerful, they're knowing and they're wise enough to realize if they snapped their fingers and instantly created a perfect world, we'd be right back into the same problems again within a matter of seconds because we don't have the wisdom that we need to make wise decisions. So this being isn't attached to us. They are interested in seeing us all live in harmony, but they understand, this being understands that it's our own wisdom that's going to produce that harmony. Like, look at our environment here. Like, I see you guys always being loving and kind and warm and gentle. I've never seen an argument in this temple, in this classroom ever. I always see you guys being loving and kind and warm and gentle with each other. That's because you have the wisdom to do that. Whereas if the other part of the world, if other parts of the world and other beings chose to learn this wisdom, they can create the harmony. God's not going to create the harmony for us. We've got to create it for ourselves. Sometimes people are waiting for somebody to show up and instantly snap their fingers and make the world perfect. Sometimes people think Jesus is going to come back, snap his fingers, and the world becomes perfect instantly. Well, if Jesus was going to do that, he would have did it the first time. Why would he wait 2,000 years to do it again, right? And you can't do that. You can't just snap your fingers. Even God, if he did that and made the world perfect, within a matter of seconds, we'd be right back into the same problems again. So the way to create harmony in the world is for people to cultivate wisdom. So God allows us to cultivate wisdom. And you guys are choosing to do that. And that's the wholesome results that you experience when you come here. You have nothing but great conversations and warm relationships with the people here because people are on the path. People are training their mind. People are wise. You guys are interacting with each other in very loving and wonderful ways. And that's why you experience those results. So the wider world could experience the same thing if they chose to cultivate wisdom, but they're not choosing to do that. So that's their choice. So they will live in whatever results that they produce based on their decisions. Either their wisdom or lack of wisdom will produce whatever results they experience. But for you, if you cultivate wisdom, understanding that this being isn't controlling you, then you can produce that harmonious life for yourself. And then that's permanent. It's long lasting. Whereas if God snapped his fingers and instantly produced a perfect world, we'd be right back into the same trouble again in a matter of seconds because we don't have the wisdom. So by the God not restraining us, allowing us to cultivate wisdom, that's what actually will produce the harmonious world. If God snapped his fingers and instantly produced a peaceful world, it wouldn't produce a peaceful world because in a matter of seconds, we'd be right back into the same problem. So oftentimes people think that God should be able to do that, but that's not what's going to produce a peaceful world because the problem is a lack of wisdom. And you can't snap your fingers and instantly give everybody wisdom. It's not possible to do that. Each individual has to cultivate that wisdom through their own free will. So these are some things to think about with God. God can guide you in the path to enlightenment. If you are interested in having a relationship with God, you can actually pray to God, or you can just talk to God and let God know that you are either aware of his existence and you're open to guidance, Or you can say, God, I don't know if you exist or not. I'm not sure. But if you do exist, feel free to give me all the guidance that you like. And it's not like God's just going to zap some guidance to you in that instant, right? But at least you let God know and you communicate to God that, hey, I'm open to a relationship with you. I would like to have a relationship with you. I don't know if you exist, or maybe you say, I know that you exist. Some people know that he exists, and anything you'd like to help me with, I'm more than willing to receive that guidance. And the way that God provides you guidance is there's like this little voice that comes into your mind every once in a while. It's like a fatherly or grandfatherly advice. But when that's occurring, God's not forcing you or controlling you what to do in that situation. He's just giving you a bit of advice. And you still need to learn, you still need to reflect, and you still need to practice to be able to see the truth for yourself. Because there's also this being Mara that's trying to influence you to do unwholesome things. And that's why you need to cultivate wisdom. You need to think and ponder to be able to discover what is truly wise and what is unwise. So there's this being of God and heavenly beings that are willing to help you and provide you guidance. And then there's these other beings. There's the Mara, in what some people would refer to as the devil or Satan. And then there's hell beings, and there's afflicted spirits that are trying to influence unwholesome things. So it still comes down to your wisdom. You need to be able to discern through your learning, your reflection, and your practice what is wise and unwise. So you can open up to this being and let this being know that you're willing to receive guidance. And then whenever this being would like to give you guidance, they will choose to do that. But they're not going to give it to you when you want it. So if you sat down and said, please, 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 God, give me guidance right now. What should I do? Should I take that job or not? God's not going to zap some wisdom to your mind. In fact, the more that you crave something, the least interested God would be into actually helping you with that particular thing, because you need to eliminate craving, desire, attachment. So you can let this being know that you're open to their guidance, and when they're willing and when they're interested to give you guidance, they will give you guidance. This being is the all-knowing and all-powerful. If you have confidence in this being, just know that this being loves you, has lots of interest in seeing you be well, and this being is going to offer you advice when it's important for you to have advice. But you're going to need to do the work to cultivate wisdom. They're not going to just teach you every little tiny thing about the path to enlightenment. But this being can be there and can help you when they feel that it's important to help you. But they're not going to just step in every single time that you think that they should step in. They're going to provide you guidance when it's appropriate. Okay, so this is a bit about this being of God and how to have a healthier relationship. Is not asking this being for tons of things through prayer. Can you imagine being God and people constantly asking you for things? Like, please give me this, give me that, give me this. Like billions of people just constantly asking you for things. And if you don't give them what they want, they get angry and they get frustrated. Can you imagine being that person? Like if you had a friend that constantly called you up on the phone every day and asked you for something, and if you didn't give them what they wanted, they got angry, would you enjoy that? Would you enjoy that relationship? Probably not, right? You probably wouldn't be friends with that person for very long. But this being experiences that all day long. People just constantly begging them for things. And then God doesn't do it. And then they get angry and they get frustrated, right? So if you would like to have a healthier relationship with this being, don't constantly ask them for things. You wouldn't do that to me. You wouldn't do that to somebody sitting next to you. You wouldn't be constantly asking them for things. So why would we do that to this being God, right? So we can have this healthy relationship by not constantly asking for things, and understanding that anything we experience is a result of our decisions, and understanding that we don't have to fear this being and we don't have to worship this being. We can have a relationship with this being just like your neighbor. You can have a relationship with your neighbor or not. And if you have a relationship with your neighbor, it's great because they have tools in their shed, right? They can come over to your house and help you with a ladder or raking the leaves or whatever. It's great to have a relationship with your friend or with your neighbor because they can help you sometimes. If you don't have a relationship with your neighbor, then you're not going to have that ability to receive that help every once in a while when you need that help. But if you're not interested in having a relationship with God, this is fine too. You don't need to have a relationship with God, just like you don't need to have a relationship with your neighbor. But it does make things a lot more enjoyable when you do have a relationship with your neighbor. But you don't have to. So if you're not interested in having a relationship with God, fine, don't have a relationship with God. But you at least need to get to the point where you don't have anger and hatred for this being. You need to have loving kindness for all beings. When the Buddha teaches you to have loving kindness and compassion for all beings, this includes all beings. Hell beings animals, afflicted spirits, humans, heavenly beings, and God's in there too. So if you have anger and hatred toward this being of God, you're not going to get to enlightenment. And sometimes what we think in the unenlightened state is that this anger, this ill will, we can somehow keep it over here, kind of compartmentalized, and kind of keep it in one little corner. And we're going to be loving and kind to all these people, but we're going to hold on to this anger for this one person. We're going to kind of compartmentalize. You guys know what I'm saying, right? We're going to kind of keep it here in this little corner. But it's not actually possible to do that, because while you're keeping that little anger right there, it's going to come out in other situations too. So you can't get to enlightenment by having anger for just one being, right? Even if you have anger for just one being, you still have ill will in your mind. You still have anger and frustration and agitation and annoyance. Sometimes even just hearing the word God, some people can get really angry when I start posting things occasionally about God here and there, because when we get to chapter 18, that will go into our Facebook group. And sometimes somebody outside of our group sees that and they get really angry at just seeing that word God, because of the things that they've been taught in the past. Or say you grew up in an environment where somebody sexually abused you that was supposed to be somebody that was teaching about God, and somebody might have been taught that they're now being punished by God, and this person's sexually abusing you. Because in some environments, we grow up as children and we're in an environment where somebody who's supposed to be very godly is now sexually abusing us. And someone might attribute those kinds of things to God and think that it's God who's sexually abusing you. And that's not true. It's that person who's doing that. It's not God that's doing that. That person isn't functioning very godly if they're choosing to sexually abuse you. But if you've been through that kind of experience, just when you hear the word God, it might arise some anger and frustration or fear or guilt or shame in your own mind, or stress or anxiety. But if you eliminate your cravings and you realize that that was that person that was choosing to sexually abuse you, it wasn't God that was doing that, because God doesn't do those kinds of things. It wasn't that person. Now maybe you can let go of this false view and this misperception, and now you might decide to have a healthy relationship with God. But at the very least, if you're not interested in having a relationship with God, you're going to need to eliminate any kind of anger and hatred and ill will and cultivate this loving kindness. So if you currently have anger, hatred, ill will for God, even if you're not interested in having a relationship with this being, you're going to need to do loving kindness meditation and include this being into your loving kindness meditation. Just like if you have that ex-boyfriend or girlfriend that you haven't seen for like 5, 10, 20 years, and you have anger and hatred in your mind for them, and you're never going to see them ever again, and you're never going to have a relationship with them ever again, you're going to need to include them in your loving kindness meditation too, in order to eliminate your anger, hatred, and ill will towards them. So it's the same thing with this being. If you're not interested in a relationship, but you have anger, hatred, and ill will towards them, you're going to need to include them in your loving kindness meditation. And then this will clear up your mind and get rid of that, so that now, without a relationship with God, you can still go forward, but you don't have this hostility and bitterness and harshness in the mind towards this being. Because you can get to enlightenment without a relationship with this being. That's possible, because they're not granting you enlightenment. But you at least need to eliminate any kind of anger, hatred, or ill will or frustration towards this being, if any of that exists now. Okay, so this is everything I have to share on this particular topic. You guys have any questions? We can go deeper into it if you guys like. Anything you guys would like to ask about?
Yeah, so it's a lot of new information for me, because till now I used to think that people are just praying to heavenly beings thinking they are God, and this is a lot of new information. So I don't know how Brahma functions, or how so does the Brahma die, or someone else become Brahma, and so if they are enlightened, do they get to Nibbana after their death, and things like this. There are a lot of questions for me to have a relationship with him.
Sure. So God is a being that has an extensively long lifespan, but God is not permanent. right? Just like all of us, this being is impermanent, but it is the same being from the beginning of time all the way to the end of time. It's the same being. It just has an amazingly long lifespan. This being is utterly patient, very, 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 very patient. This being has been in existence ever since the beginning of time and will be in existence all the way to the end of time, but they're ultimately impermanent, just like us. Mm-hmm. What's that? You have what? Oh, you forgot your question. Oh, okay, no worries. All right. Let me see if we have anything online. Let's see. Just see some thank yous and some whys from different people. Somebody writing in Thai. I can't read Thai, so I don't know. Oh, you have a question?
I
Karen?
do.
Yeah.
Kind of trying to place some things that I grew up in, this idea of mystery and miracles and sort of this serendipity. And I'm now curious as where I get that it's cause and effect, but my experience of these things that I'm calling miracles and serendipity and mystery seem to have a time that seems really, it's not there and then it's suddenly there, and it sort of appears in life. And I'm really curious about that now.
I'm not sure I understand your question 100%.
I'm not sure I understand my own question.
But let me share this with you. Based on what you just said, let me
Yeah.
share this with you. And I don't know that you think this way, but I'll just share this.
Yeah.
Oftentimes when the topic of God comes up, a lot of times people think of it kind of in mystical and magical terms, right? Because this being, a lot of times people don't understand, and they haven't really had much contact with this being. But there's been a lot of contact between this being and I understand this being very well. The way that I have come to think about this being is just like a neighbor, that this is a being that you can have a relationship with or not. There's nothing mystical or magical about this being. It's a true, real being that exists. This being is around and knows everything, but there's nothing mystical or magical about this being. They do have the ability to do things, and this being has done plenty of things around me to prove that it exists. But I understand that it's all about my decisions and cultivating my wisdom. Even though this being has the ability to do lots of things in the world, this being doesn't do those things. Sometimes we like to think in very mystical and magical terms, and this is oftentimes based in belief. But from my experience, it's just like a neighbor. This being is just like a neighbor. You can either have a relationship with this being or not. And there's a way to have a healthy relationship with a neighbor, and there's a way to not. And because the unenlightened mind struggles with how to have a healthy relationship with a neighbor, right? Like if you're having challenges with having a healthy relationship with your mom and your dad and your brothers and your sisters and your boyfriends and your girlfriends, if you're having troubles in those relationships, you're going to have trouble in this relationship too. Sometimes people think that this relationship should be perfect, but because you have challenges in those other relationships, you're going to also have challenges in this kind of relationship. And part of what I'm teaching you here is to how to have a healthy relationship with this being, which you can also translate into your day-to-day life with human beings too. Because any of these things that I talked about here, where I was talking about having right view with God, you're going to need to have that with your brothers and sisters and your parents too, not blaming them for the things that you're experiencing. You're going to need to eliminate any craving where you're constantly asking your mom and dad, do this, do that, do this, or your brothers and sisters, and you're constantly wanting to be with them, where you're attached to them and wanting to be with them all the time, right? Or attached to them as a person. You're going to need to eliminate that too, because as long as you have expectations and wanting from your parents or your brothers and sisters, that's not going to promote a healthy relationship either. Understanding cause and effect. that our parents aren't the ones who created any kind of miserable life for us, that anything we experienced are decisions that we were making, where if we understand cause and effect and the natural law of karma, and we don't blame our parents and our brothers and sisters for things, then we'll have healthier relationships with them too. Then if we don't fear our parents, there was a time where I feared my parents. When I was younger, I would get beat quite a bit as a child. And there was a period of time where I feared them, but eventually I got to the point where I didn't fear them anymore. And that actually produced a better relationship. But there was a time where I had fear, and I had a fear for God at one time too. But as long as there's fear in the mind related to a relationship, you'll have difficulties in that relationship. And then these things, understanding that God isn't attached to us and he's not responsible to restrain us. So these kinds of things can be applied to your day-to-day life with human beings to help you have healthier relationships with them. And then having learned how to have healthier relationships with the people around you, it'll help you to have a healthy relationship with this being if you choose to do that. But you don't have to. And it's not anything mystical or magical. It's just like a neighbor. I think your mic went out. There you go. Yep.
Actually, I think as you're saying that, David, I think the question's more in the natural law of karma for me.
Mm-hmm.
Almost more like this instantaneous karma,
Mm-hmm.
which I know is nothing necessarily related to that. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that experience of, and we can talk about this another time because it's not really related. I'm seeing now it's not related to
Sure.
to God in this respect. It's more the experience of, I think it's instant karma where something gets realized instantly.
Is that what your mind's wanting, or that's what you're?
I've had experiences of that.
Mm-hmm.
Looking to understand more of that is in the teaching.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about it because the mic's not working anyway.
Because it comes in for me originally from mystery as if it was God, but it's actually not. And I think I understand that, but it's interesting for me to understand where that relates.
Sure. Yeah, you can share those kinds of things with me because God does perform miracles around human beings in order to help us see that he exists. And he did countless miracles around me in order to convince me of his existence because based on what I'm doing in life, he needed that. He needed me to understand his existence and what he does. And I can now share that with others to clear up their understanding. And he might do those kinds of things in your life too, where he performs different miracles. So you can share those with me and I can share my thoughts with you about what I know. Mm-hmm. I apologize, the mic's not working.
Do I understand right that that no God would be able to create a world where everybody is wide awake enlightened? This is just not possible, right? Or could he do that? I mean, he also created other planets with beings, I think, and yeah.
In my opinion, God could do this, but he wouldn't do it because he understands that, and you can understand that if your mind was preloaded with a bunch of software to think a certain way, you probably wouldn't like that, right? So instead, he's allowing you the free will to cultivate whatever wisdom it is that you would like to cultivate. So while God has the power to do anything and everything, I've seen him do amazing things. And I haven't even seen everything that he could do. And I know because of the things that he showed me and the power that he has, I know that if he wanted to, he could shake this entire earth. He could rain down lightning bolts. He could turn the sky purple and blue and orange and green and convince everybody that he exists. But he doesn't do that because he knows that there will be a lot of fear. So I have no doubt that this being could create a world where everybody was enlightened. But that is to preload everybody with a bunch of software and not give them free will choice of whether they would like to get to enlightenment or not. So while he could do it, in my opinion, he doesn't do it because he knows that it's unwise. Mm-hmm. All right. So I think that's everything that you guys are asking about right now. So as you guys think about these different topics and as you think about what it is that I share with you. You might have questions in the future, and you'll hear me probably give this discussion in other programs that we have as well. And, different students will ask different questions. So you're not going to understand everything about God in one conversation. So maybe our conversation here has helped you to think about some things maybe a bit differently than what you are currently thinking about with this God, in this being. And that's good. Right? I'm not here to convince you to think of God in the same way as me. I'm not here to do any of that. I'm just here to share with you what I know about this being. And then you can think about that and you can ask me questions in the future. But there is the ability to have a healthy relationship with this being. Even if you haven't had one in the past, you can cultivate that healthy relationship. If you would like to learn how to do that, I can help you to learn how to do that and teach you how to do that. But at the same time, if you're not interested in a relationship with this being, I can teach you how to do that too and still get to enlightenment. And that's why I can teach you both options here. So as you're learning and growing, if you would like to talk about this being at any point, you're more than welcome to do that. And I'll be able to help you to understand what I know about this being. So after our lunch break, we're going to learn the meditation to eliminate sexual cravings and the meditation to realize non-self. And then we'll actually do that one after I teach it to you. So right now it's 12:15. We should be able to come back at, 1:45. We should still be able to get an hour and a half lunch, because what I have to teach you is actually really short. It's really brief to teach you these two meditations. So enjoy your hour and a half lunch, and I'll see you at 1:45. Okay? Thank you guys for your questions, and we'll see you guys after lunch.